Did you know?
History books for life. History books for life.
And
Africa is not our home. Oh, while I did Africa is not our home.
because
The Indians were you. The Indians were you. The Indians were you.
that's why.
Finds himself in exile in his own land. His own land.
So,
You just want to claim a spot for the whole thing.
because
We were always here. We were always here. We were always here. We were always here.
Welcome to the Aboriginal channel. This episode will be part 3 to the Ugliest Aboriginal Truth. Here I found a clipping online I would like to read. In 1821, in order to administer the U.S. government's Native American policies, Congress made a new agency within the War Department called the Bureau of Indian Affairs, which worked closely with the U.S. Army to enforce their policies. At times, the federal government recognized the Indians as self-governing, independent political communities with varying cultural identities. However, at other times, the government attempted to force the Native American tribes to abandon their cultural identity, give up their land, and assimilate into the American culture. The U.S. government's policies towards Native Americans in the second half of the 19th century was influenced by the desire to expand westward into territories occupied by these Indian tribes. In parts 1 and 2, we looked at the when and the where. In this one, we're going to be focusing more on how they did it. So looking back at the Vicksburg National Military Park from the book A Guide to America's Greatest Historic Places, on May of 18th, 1863, launched a campaign to take the stronghold by siege. So we're going to look at what he means by siege. But before we look at what the siege is all about, I want to look at some word etymology on Vicksburg. So it says Vicksburg was strategically situated on high bluffs overlooking the Mississippi, and it had impregnable defenses. Now, Vicksburg, we'll break that word down into two words, Vicks and Berg. The first word we'll look at is Berg. It's a stronghold, a fortified town, enclosed, fortified place, stronghold. That's what a Berg is. You go over to Vic. Vic means the bishop. And bishop means a spiritual overseer or overseer. That breaks down into above and then looking. So they had embankments, palisade walls, and behind those walls, sometimes there would be a mound complex above ground over 100 feet. So they could be able to look in all directions over the walls at anybody trying to creep up. So Vicksburg means a fortified town with people above looking over. Now we'll go over and read what the siege was about. It says, in siege warfare, the introduction of rifling had the opposite effect. In the 1860s, artillery officers discovered that rifle siege howitzers, substantially larger than field howitzers, were a more efficient means of destroying walls, particularly walls protected by certain kinds of interwoven obstacles. Pause. So you remember, let's go back over here. From the book written in 1851 called The History of Alabama and that of Georgia and Mississippi, it says that they all fronted a large public square. They were encompassed by a high wall made of immense trunks of trees set deep in the ground and close together, strengthened with cross timbers and interwoven with large vines. It goes on to say the most famous of these gun howitzers was the Napoleon 12-pounder, a weapon of French design that saw extensive service in the American Civil War. This is what a 12-pounder Napoleon howitzer looked like. In the explanation over here, it says how later called medium siege howitzers had calibers between 200 and 220 millimeters and fired shells that weighed about 100 kilograms or 220 pounds. It further says, thus, at the same time, armies were taking howitzers of one sort out of their field batteries. They were introducing howitzers of another sort into their siege trains and fortresses. Now we're going to take a look back at some of the areas that the Civil War battles took place in and try to correlate some of the information known about those areas. disregard for the time being the maps above with the squiggly lines. We'll get to that in just a second. Right now, let's zero in on these battles. On this map, I want to point out 3 interesting areas to add some information to. But first, let's just look at the fact that there were battles over here in the handle of Texas, way over here in, I think, Idaho, and also New Mexico. These were Indian wars. This was the Apache, I believe, or could have been Navajo. These were other Indians fighting in New Mexico. And at the same time of this war, these so-called Civil War, you had the California Indian Wars taking place in between 1861 and 1865. So when Trump said he's working at almost as hard as Abe Lincoln, that's what they're talking about. Now, if we look down here at these battles in the Florida area, you think about the history of Florida and you know that the Seminole Indians and other tribesmen were down there fighting in 3 different Seminole Wars. The last one ending in 1858, 3 years before the Civil War started. So it's hard for me to believe that there were some kind of European people down there wanting to fight the Union Army for slavery or anything when they wasn't there yet. Out of the 70 counties that exist in Florida, 30 of them were made in 1861 or sooner. Most of those were created in the 1900s. So there's no way there was enough Europeans there to fight the Union Army. Now, if you look over here to Oklahoma, Oklahoma became a state in 1907. So these palisaded communities must have been those Indians from some areas over here in the east who had to walk during the Trail of Tears. When they got there, they built palisade walls right away, right there in Oklahoma. So that's the second one. Then if we look over here in Virginia, this area up here with all of these battles condensed in this area, if you look, what exists there is a massive the Indian community called the Shenandoah River Village. This is an image of the Shenandoah River Village. See the 7 bends of Shenandoah River. Small mounds, large mounds. That's what exists right there in that area of the battles in Virginia. This is an interesting Civil War monument. What is very, very interesting about it is this figure right back here inside of this molding here. Right here. See his face? The maps above the battle map and to the side are railroad tracks. One is to the right above is from 1860, before the Civil War, and the one to the left is afterwards. I wanted to point out that most of these areas, say for an example in Louisiana, the battle sites have railroad tracks going through them after the battles. Now you can study this map real well. See down here where the Attapacas was at, right down here by Galveston, on this side of Louisiana where the battles took place. There's a railroad track going through it right there. Over here by Alexander, where there was the Red River parish that popped up, right here's the railroad. See the railroad track? Right there. Vicksburg had a railroad track already there. That's why I believe what the other brothers were saying about there being railroad tracks already here in America owned by the Indians. Most of these tracks, I believe, was owned by the Indians. If you look at the battles along the East Coast from Florida into Georgia, South Carolina, over to North Carolina, you can look and see how these railroad tracks before the Civil War in 1860 go to all those spots, the exact spot. Now, if you follow this track up into Virginia, where all those battles took place near the Shenandoah River Village, you'll see extensive railroad tracks in 1860. How many were under the control of Indians? I'm not sure, but I'm sure there were many, just because of the palisaded communities and military type fortifications that they had that would probably involve some sort of railroad track system. I found these maps of railroad tracks in a book called Old South, New South, Revolutions in the Southern Economy Since the Civil War by Gavin Wright. So I'll leave that up here for a little while so you can study it a little. Then I will end the video with a read. It says the deadly history of this infamous site in Mississippi is terrifying but true. Of all the historic sites in Mississippi, few have a past as deadly as the Devil's Punch Bowl in Natchez. According to local legend, pirates once used the secluded area as both a hideout and a spot to bury their loot. In recent years, the story behind the Devil's Punch Bowl grew increasingly sinister when a mass grave was found in the area. As historians looked into the grisly discovery, they learned that the grave held the bodies of thousands of slaves. As the story unraveled, researchers were faced with an even more terrifying reality. The bodies belonged to slaves who were freed and then imprisoned in a concentration camps located in the Devil's Punch Bowl. Now we know those camps were actually fortified Indian mound villages. Through the history books, which has all been a lie, so therefore, if it's a lie, then what's the truth? If it's a lie, then what's the truth?